That memory-bound predecessors, the goal of training one's memory was not to become a living book, but rather a living concordance, a walking index of everything one had read and all the information one had acquired. It was about more than merely possessing an internal library of facts, quotes, and ideas. It was about building an organizational scheme for accessing them. Consider, for example, Peter of Ravenna, a leading 15th century Italian jurist. Also, one gets the impression one of the 15th century leading self-promoters, who authored one of the era's most successful books on memory training, titled Phoenix. It was translated into several languages and reprinted all across Europe. It was just the most famous of a handful of memory treatises created from the 13th century onward that helped make memory techniques that had long been exclusive purview of scholars and monks available to a wider audience of doctors, lawyers, tradesmen, and everyday folks who just wanted to remember stuff. One finds books from the period on every variety of mnemonic subjects, including how to use hard memory in gambling, how to use it to keep track of debt, how to memorize the contents of ships, how to remember the names of acquaintances, and how to memorize playing cards. Peter, for his part, bragged of having memorized 20,000 legal points, 1,000 texts by Ovid, 200 of Cicero's speeches, and sayings, 300 sayings of philosophers, 7,000 texts of scripture, as well as a host of other classical works. For leisure, he would reread books cached away in his many memory palaces. When I left my country to visit as a pilgrim the cities of Italy, I can truly say I carried everything I owned with me, he wrote. To store all those images, Peter started with 100,000 Lucy, but he was always picking up new memory palaces on his travels across Europe. He constructed a mental library of sources and quotations on every important subject, classified alphabetically. He boasts, for example, that filed away in his brain under the letter A were sources on subjects: de alimentis, de alienation, de absentia, de aberratis, de appellationnibus, et de similibus alientinio, que der nostro habenter incipentibus indicita literae about provision, about foreign region property, and about absence, about judges, about appeals, and about similar matters in our law, which begins with the letter A. Each piece of knowledge was assigned a specific address. When he wished to expound on a given topic, he simply reached into the proper chamber of the proper memory palace and pulled out the proper source. When the point of reading is, as it was for Peter of Ravenna, remembering, you approach a text very differently than most of us do today. Now we put a premium on reading quickly and widely, and that breeds a kind of superficiality in our reading and in what we seek to get out of books. You can't read a page a minute. The way at which you're probably reading this book, and expect to remember what you've read for any considerable length of time. If something is going to be made memorable, it has to be dwelled upon, repeated. In his essay, The First Step Toward the History of Reading, Robert Darnto described a switch of intensive to extensive reading that occurred as books began to proliferate. Until relatively recently, people read intensively, say Darnton. They had only a few books, the Bible, an almanac, a devoted work or two, and they read them over and over again, usually aloud and in groups. So that narrow range of traditional literature became deeply impressed on their consciousness. But after the printing press appeared around 1440, things began gradually to change in the first century. After Gutenberg, the number of books in existence increased 14-fold. It became possible for the first homes and trove of easily consulted external memories close at hand today. We read books extensively without much in the way of sustained focus, and with range exceptions. We read each book only once. We value quantity of reading over quality of reading. We have no choice if we want to keep up with the broader culture. Even in most highly specialized fields, it can be a sisyphean task to try to stay on top of the ever-growing mountain of words loosed upon the word each day. Few of us make any serious effort to remember what we read. When I read a book, what do I hope will stay with me a year later? If it's a work of nonfiction, the thesis maybe. If the book has a few savory details perhaps. In fiction, the broader outline of the plot, something about the main characters, at least their names, and an overall critical judgment about the book. Even these are likely to fade. Looking up at my shelves at the books that have drained so many of my waking hours is always a dispiriting experience. 100 Years of Solitude. I remember magical realism and I enjoyed heights. I remember exactly two things: that I read it in high school English teacher class and that there was a character named Heathcliff. I couldn't say whether I liked the book or not. I didn't think I'm an exceptionally bad reader. I suspect that many people maybe even most are like me. We read and read and read and we forget and forget and forget. So why do we bother? Mitchell de expressed the dilemma of extensive reading in 1673. A leaf through books, I do not study them. He wrote, what I retain of them is something I no longer recognize. As anyone else, it is only the material from which my judgment has profited, and thoughts and ideas with which it has become imbued. The author, the place, the words, and other circumstances I immediately forget. He goes on to explain how to compensate a little for the treachery and weakness of my memory. He adopted the habit of writing in the back of every book a short critical judgment, as to have at least some general idea of what the tome was about and what he thought of it. You might think that the advent of printing and the ability to more easily offload memories from brains onto paper would have immediately rendered the old memory techniques irrelevant, but that's not what happened. At least not right away. In fact, paradoxically, at the exact moment when neat rendering of history would suggest that the art of memory should have been on its way to obsolete, it underwent its greatest renaissance.